Please go ahead and turn on your camera. All right. Great, thank you. Looks like just about everybody is back, and I'm looking to see if we have our policy roundtable members with us. Okay. I'm sorry that was a very brief break, especially for those who were having lunch, but thank you for coming right back. And let me just actually kind of do a brief roll call on the policy roundtable to see if we do have everybody here. Because we have an hour. Good, here's the list. And CEPAC is back, but let me just introduce and hopefully check in with the people who are going to join us. First, Kelsey Blair, who's Vice President for Clinical Solutions at Express Scripts. Kelsey, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, and when you speak, you pop right up into my window. So thanks
Perfect.
very much. Do you want to give folks a tiny bit of background because you have some experience looking at digital health technologies?
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Kelsey Blair. I'm a pharmacist by training, and I serve as the Vice President of Clinical Programs at Express Scripts. My team and I are responsible for delivering maximum health outcomes for our clients that adopt our programs. And a couple of programs that we work on specifically are supporting patients with opioid utilization, with behavioral health conditions, as well as promoting the use of digital therapeutics in the realm of the healthcare space.
Fantastic. So a great person to have with us today. Thank you very much. Anita Ju, are you here? I know I saw your name up, so I think.
Hi, this is Anita.
Oh, great. So Anita, you are with Blue Shield of California. Why don't you let people know what your role there is and again, kind of the relationship with digital health technologies.
Sure. So I'm an innovation manager in our lifestyle medicines team. My team, we survey the market for appropriate digital health and digital therapeutics products, do an assessment, and then we also either contract them as a vendor or provider, or we will invest in them depending on what series they're in their development, and then do a co-development. So my team does a lot of pilots so that we can collect data in order to later on produce a value-based payment model. That's our goal.
Fantastic. We'll be talking about all aspects of that this afternoon. So that's great. And with us, we still have Dr. Kamarami, right? Miriam, are you still with us? Good. Okay.
Yes, I am.
And we met Hans Moorfield before, but Hans, why don't you introduce yourself again?
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Hans Moorfield. I'm the CEO of Chest Health and looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Jake, I never gave you a chance really to describe, Jake Nichols, to give a chance to describe your role at Professional Recovery Associates. So why don't you just say hi again and tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So Jake Nichols, pharmacist in long-term recovery, has been working in the field of substance use disorders in many different roles over the past decade. Professional Recovery Associates is my own consulting group. I previously was with a company called Axial Healthcare out of Nashville, who is working directly with health plans to build up recovery support programs. And my current initiative is really focused on building a telemedicine-based SUD treatment platform. Okay. Pleasure to be with you guys today. Thank you.
No, thank you again. Great. Mike Pace with Pear Therapeutics. Are you here?
Hi, Steve, and hello, Policy Roundtable participants. I'm Mike Pace. I head up Pear's market access, value and evidence activities, and essentially what that means is interfacing with payers to support coverage of our products, but additionally and importantly, value demonstration and real-world evidence generation activities at Pear.
Great. And my understanding is that in your past life, at least, and probably now too, but you had a fair amount of experience working on outcomes-based agreements with payers, the kinds of over time longitudinal kinds of contracts. So we'll talk a fair amount about the opportunities to do some of those for digital health therapeutics. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
And Kevin Roy, who was with us earlier. But again, do you want to tell us about your role at Shatterproof?
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thank you for having me. I'm Chief Public Policy Officer for Shatterproof, and we are for those that don't know, a grassroots organization focused on treatment quality, as well as public policy and education for the public about reversing the addiction crisis. And so my interest in this area really precedes my role at Shatterproof. I'm with Shatterproof for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was with Autism Speaks for about 11 years, and there's a lot of interest in digital therapeutics in that space as well. And so really looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, fantastic. And Scott, Dr. Scott Steiger, who was with us earlier today, you are still with us, yes?
Yep.
There you are.
My name is Scott Steiger. I'm a faculty at University of California, San Francisco, but my main day job is helping to run the opiate treatment outpatient program, which is an OTP based at San Francisco General Hospital. So we care for like 600 people with opioid use disorder at any one time.
That's great. That's where I did my medical training as a medical student. So it's always nice to have folks from UCSF on board. And Miriam, I know, again, you're well known to the folks who've been watching all day, but do you want to just introduce yourself and what you do at Boston Medical Center?
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm also from UCSF. I went to medical school residency and did a Robert Wood Johnson clinical scholars program there, and then was on the faculty for a number of years. But after that, I moved back to New Mexico, which is where I was from. And I've done a variety of I've practiced in a lot of different clinical settings and done addiction medicine in various settings. I've done a lot of education of healthcare providers related to addiction treatment. I've done some research, and I've been involved in some policy issues. I'm also on the board of directors of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is the largest professional society for addiction treatment providers. And in my current role at Boston Medical Center, I'm the medical director of the Graken Center for Addiction, which is an umbrella organization over the many addiction treatment and harm reduction parts of Boston Medical Center.
Okay. Fabulous. I kind of feel like we have a dream team here of people from different perspectives, and we could go off and with your help kind of create a great guide to the future. So let's try and do that. Could we take down the slide now and go back so folks can see it? Good. And the New England CEPAC will still be, no, sorry, not New England. Wow, Midwest CEPAC will still be with us as we go through this discussion. But since we have, honestly, we're going to spend only until about 40 minutes after the next hour, I want to just jump right in. And I guess I will start with the clinical experts. You heard the discussion. You've already known a lot about these types of interventions, the state of the evidence as they are today. The CEPAC voted that the evidence wasn't adequate yet to demonstrate a net health benefit of adding in Reset-O or the others to standard care. Do you think insurance companies should cover these? Dr. Kamarami, what do you think? No pressure.
Well, I guess I agree with the CEPAC vote that I think we're not quite there yet. I think these are incredibly promising. I think we should be collecting a lot of data on them, but I think that right now when we don't have strong enough evidence of benefit, and you know, you might say, well, why not do it anyway, because it might help. But I guess my concern is there are other types of things that we know are really helpful. I mean, a different type of evidence, but things like 12-step or peer support groups that, you know, we see demonstrably improving our patients' lives on a regular basis. If they did this instead, is it going to keep them from developing peer networks, et cetera? So I think there's a little bit of an opportunity cost to participate in something like this, that if we don't know that it benefits, what is it replacing that we think is beneficial? Similarly with counseling, someone might be getting counseling that would address their co-occurring depression or PTSD, as opposed to this sort of mono-focused app that could be a better way of a patient using their time.
Yeah, we didn't talk very much. I mean, we talked about harms and the lack of harm, but the opportunity cost of spending time trying one avenue, of course, as Jake and others noted, patients frequently do take many different starts and stops and come back and cycle through different approaches. But that's an interesting perspective. And Scott, what do you think? Is the evidence there yet to suggest that insurance should cover this? Obviously, patients could pay for it out of pocket, but what do you think about insurance covering these things? What would be needed, or is it already there from your perspective?
I mean, the evidence is not there to support it as being in current state to really support that. But I mean, we would welcome, and we have welcomed, their collaboration on trying to see how it works in different settings. And I think that I mean, part of my beef with just taking the approach of just saying, oh, it shows promise, let's see if let's just make it available to everybody, is similar to Miriam's, but it's also sort of how we've done things for addiction medicine historically, which is unfortunate. And we really should be working on developing the same, we should be held as a field to the same standards that we hold all other aspects of medicine. Because to me, it's just another example of how the stigma plays out even at the professional level, where it's like, oh yeah, they just go and talk about their problems and they fix it that way, kind of thing. And it's outside of the medical field. And if we don't hold ourselves to the same standards that we do for hypertension, then we're not doing our jobs.
All right, well, let me invite the manufacturers to chime in before I turn around to the payers. And I have a particular question that you may have your own thoughts on how to answer what you've just heard, but I would not be surprised if part of your view is that you don't have to show that your app improves outcomes compared to not using the app. The whole point of the app is to expand the number of patients who can receive treatment. And so it doesn't matter that it's no better. If it's just as good or even almost as good, if we can get it to an additional, few 100,000 people who wouldn't otherwise get treatment, then that's the goal here. And so the evidence target should be different for these kinds of interventions. And you can imagine I'm going to ask the payers about this too. But well, how would you respond to this question of whether the evidence is ready for prime time yet?
Yeah.
I have a feeling you're going to say something different. Hans, go ahead.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I guess there are a couple of comments. One is to, it was a great discussion today about, the question of, is cognitive behavioral therapy delivered through an app, worth, have a payback? Has that been demonstrated in a real clinical environment? I think what I would add to this discussion, though, is that payers are paying for this technology to support their members and to support treatment and outcomes, but they're looking at it more broadly than how today's discussion was just about. So in our case, payers are paying for our platform in order to do positive things like, one, address isolation, which they've been able to demonstrate that this supports individuals too. Secondly, is to improve the connection between their case managers and their own members, and to facilitate improved connections between those same individuals and their providers. So there are benefits that payers, as well as capturing data from these members in real time. It's helpful both from a clinical perspective and from a population health perspective. So one comment is that, today's discussion and evidence study was very narrowly focused, but digital health technologies like ours do serve a much broader purpose and generate value to different organizations in a multitude of ways for which they're willing to reimburse. Now, they may not think that's worth, $300 a month for 3 months or $500 a month for 3 months, but there's definitely a compelling ROI to them. And so I guess that's, my first contribution to this conversation.
All right, and
Yeah,
Mike,
Steve,
I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, sure, Steve. I appreciate that, and to the team. Certainly, the discussion that we had this morning was was highly literature-based. And the danger in that, albeit respectfully, it's important, it's central to what we're doing, but the danger in it is the reality. And that's the reality that I think Jeff so eloquently kicked us off with this morning, that we have a terrible problem. We have a crisis that during just this meeting today, 75 more Americans are going to overdose and die while we've been on this call from their opioid use disorder. And that's frightening, absolutely frightening. And I think Mel did a wonderful job really teeing up for a payer what the investment is in a product like Reset-O based on its price over a 5-year time horizon. And she showed that $155 per year over 5 years is the investment. This is not hemophilia like was discussed the day the evidence report was produced here. This is not that type of cost structure. But these are people that have one foot on a banana peel and the other one close to a grave. And it's $155 per year of an incremental investment. Not only that, I would say that we have to step back and think about the fact that we did look at TES, NIDA-funded product here, that we've mobilized for all of the contextual benefits and considerations that patients spoke of today, and that we all agreed today were important in many respects. But what we didn't spend time on was the real world evidence demonstrating the value of Reset-O and demonstrating the fact that, in fact, the slide didn't show it, demonstrating the fact that in 351 OUD patients being treated with Reset-O over the course of this past near period, pre-COVID, that their buprenorphine adherence increased in a highly statistically significant way.
Mike, can I just break in? I understand your perspective on this. I actually don't want to get back into the data because that's kind of what the morning is about. I want to ask you about, do you think that with the crisis upon us, and you could say that we have a really, as you said, a strikingly critical ongoing national crisis with opioids, it's even higher responsibility for people who are trying to offer new treatments and interventions to demonstrate the effectiveness of their treatments, because we want to make sure that we direct patients from the beginning to the most effective treatments. You know, is there not some tension that would kind of call for a higher standard than what the FDA minimum is to get over that bar?
I'm not sure what the higher standard is. We're in the middle of coronavirus, and we're asking for the FDA to authorize utilization of products that were accelerated in their use. And in this case,
but they're not approving any of those without randomized controlled trial data. And so I think of the intervention itself with good controls and outcomes that are measured. So we'll come back to this, because I actually do want to come back to the ROI issue that Hans raised as well, that payers and others are seeing. So let's talk to a couple payers. So it's your job, you guys, Kelsey and Anita, you guys look at dozens, hundreds. People are trying to, because this is a completely, I wouldn't say Wild West in the bad sense. In the good sense, there's all kinds of innovation going on, not just in opioid use, but obviously other areas where digital health might be helpful. But in the opioid use area, when you look at this evidence and you start to think of what you want to see to believe that you think that insurance should cover this, what are you looking for conceptually? And then we'll start to break it down into different kinds of evidence. What are you looking for, Kelsey? I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you for that reminder. So I'll start by agreeing that there's certainly a need to support patients when and where they need to be treated, especially for behavioral health conditions like opioid use disorder. There's also a lot of validity and importance in leveraging technology to engage patients with an updated care model. And there's no doubt that this is a challenging time and it's a challenging condition to truly manage, which calls for innovative solutions. And we ultimately do want to strive to make health care more affordable, more predictable, and simpler to access now and in the future. And like I mentioned before, at Express Scripts, we are very vocal proponents of digital therapeutics and their roles in therapy. But as you mentioned, not all digital therapeutics are created equally. And so we have to carefully and methodically have to vet those digital therapeutics so that they demonstrate effectiveness and clinical outcomes. And so for digital health tools specifically, we need to ensure a couple of different things. 1, clinical effectiveness. 2, usability. 3, security of the data. And 4, financial value. And for these that we've been discussing today, specifically, as we've all come to an agreement, at this time with the current data, it's low value for the dollars. And so what we need to see is a higher value delivered real world and through the data.
So, everybody will get a bite at this apple too, but let me start with your rubric of 4 items. What does clinical effectiveness look like? Does it require an RCT to demonstrate clinical effectiveness for this kind of app or not?
Well, of course, we always prefer random controlled trials. I think it was mentioned before, maintaining that level of standard of evidence like we do with other disease states. We'd love to see that here. We'd love to see it with digital therapeutics. So we need to see that. We also need to see evidence on how this actually plays out. So I understand that adherence, retention with medication-assisted treatment has been one of the measures of outcomes. But if you think about why we place such an important value on that, it's because medication-assisted therapy has been shown to decrease mortality, which is the ultimate end goal. So I'd like to see more data that's specific to the ultimate outcome of decreased mortality rates and decreased morbidity. So what's happening with opioid overdoses, both even non-fatal overdoses? Do these digital therapeutics work to really address the concerns that we truly have associated with the opioid crisis, not just adherence or retention with medication-assisted treatment?
Okay, thanks. Anita, let me invite you to comment too. You can either follow in that train or go a different direction, but the basic idea is what level of evidence, are you looking for an app in this area? And if you will, what kinds of clinical studies need to be done to generate that kind of evidence? You design them yourselves, as you said, you work on pilot programs. So what do you think?
So we would need to see more real world evidence. So we definitely prefer to see if digital therapeutics company had a partnership or worked with a payer before and can produce data from that previous partnership. Otherwise, we would want to implement a pilot across our membership and then see measure the outcomes over the course of, I would say, at least 2 years before we even think about offering it to the rest of our membership.
So I'm hearing kind of two issues that are interesting because they're somewhat distinct, at least in the evidence-based medicine world. One is studies that will really help us tease out the incremental added benefit of this app or this program. And the other is the generalizability or whether it works in your population, because we know that, if you're looking at pills, a pill is a pill is a pill wherever it goes. But if you do a study of any kind of personnel intervention or system intervention, and you do it in one setting, it may work there, but may not work in another setting for any number of reasons. So it sounds like to you, really important is to test drive it in your system, or at least another payer system. But when you talk about 2 years of outcomes, are you talking about just pre-post kinds of analyses, or just you're not trying to randomize or cluster randomized patients, you're just watching to see what happens? What kinds of outcomes do you look for over 2 years?
So we look for clinical outcomes, so any types of measures that are related to certain conditions, ER admissions reductions, and then of course also cost of healthcare savings.
Yeah.
And so we can follow like membership if we have, let's say, like 2,000 members that we offer this to. So implementation looks like we do outreach to them and maybe only 10% of them adopt it. And then so there's an inherent bias to who uses digital therapeutics products. And then from there, like we can learn how do we help the adoption rate increase across other types of personas.
Got it. Now, is that adoption rate, Kelsey, is that kind of what you meant by usability, or was that something different?
Usability meaning what is the member experience? What is the patient's experience?
And do you usually expect to see data on that, or anecdotes? What do you usually look for?
Yes, or for our teams themselves to work through what the digital experience is for the end user.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I see.
So we measure data on usabilities as well. So how sticky the digital product is, how many clicks, and different KPIs on that front as well.
Do you guys look for evidence? I mean, again, this will depend on the app and the situation, but we'll get back to this, kind of the system ROI in some sense. But if there are apps that I guess could potentially lighten the load for physicians or might add a burden of administrative or other kinds of things they have to worry about, do you try to capture the physician experience in some tangible way in the work that you do? And if so, how do you do that? Do you actually have surveys of the doctors, or do you interview them? What do you do, Anita? Oh,
so
sorry.
We do patient interviews as well as provider interviews on certain innovations or different types of products like this. And we also try to capture and basically create a patient journey map and a provider journey map. So we would need to promote a product that doesn't disrupt the provider workflow. It needs to be seamlessly integrated into the provider workflow so that they don't need to learn to use another app, or like in their busy days, like they don't need to think about using another platform.
Right. Now, in my admittedly limited discussion with payers around some of these issues, a fair amount of that happened when electronic medical records were being introduced. And the companies swore upside and downside that it was not going to adversely affect clinician productivity. They were going to adopt these electronic medical records, and it was easy. See, I can show it to you right here. They'll love it. They'll click a box. It's all so easy. And then the physicians go into what's called the valley of death, when they could not basically get out of the office until midnight. They started resigning. They cut back their practice hours. And yet we survived, or maybe we're still barely surviving. So Kelsey, I know you were going to jump in too, but this idea of physician productivity or usability on the clinician side, how do you think about that? How do you try to assess it?
Yeah, so that's a really great consideration. Especially, I know that paratherapeutics, theirs is prescription only, meaning this has to be promoted with prescribers, with the providers. So that in and of itself is probably a hurdle that we don't see with all digital therapeutics on the marketplace, because not all of them are prescription only. But of course, we do really want to understand, how is the physician going to regard this information? Are they going to embrace this technology as part of their treatment plan? Because if we promote it directly to the patient, that's one way to promote digital therapeutics. But where we see the most benefit is when we, the payers, promote it alongside of their healthcare provider. So it's that reinforcement of, no, this is worthwhile. Invest in it, learn how to use it, etc., to ensure that, just like with any, not just opioid use disorder, but with any treatment plan, it helps to have multiple points of reinforcement and re-education. And that's got to be true with digital therapeutics as well. And in order for us to truly assess that across the board, not just with digital therapeutics, not just with with Reset O or in any of the other apps that we've been talking about, but just with interventions in general that we work to really impact the health outcomes of patients, we work with a panel of advisory physicians. We bring them in on a monthly touch point. Right now, we're all virtual, of course, but we'll sit with them in extended periods of time saying, we'd like to work through these interventions to accomplish this. What's your anticipated experience? Are you going to be able to embrace this in your workflow, or is this going to be completely disruptive? If we send you a fax, are you going to read it, or is it going to go into the shredder, right? Because we know that everyone's on a budget, both dollars and time. And so we want to be able to show that we're maximizing both of those.
Yeah. So Scott and Miriam, if the NIH said, we're going to give you all the money you need to run the trial that you would want to run to understand more about Reset O and these other apps, what would you design? What would the trial look like?
I'm going to let Miriam weigh in with more detail, but I would want other medications to start. We have 3 FDA-approved substances, buprenorphine, extended release naltrexone, and methadone. Those are all available. If they want to demonstrate that they have effectiveness, I want to see it with all of the medications. And with buprenorphine, of course, we have multiple formulations available. And you could imagine, right? We know that the evidence is that for antagonists, extended release naltrexone, that contingency management is one of the only ways you can get people to stay on the medication. So it's an effective medication in with very limited applicability right now. This would be a space where it would be a good investment, I believe, on the part of the companies to try to find a market for and find some evidence of effectiveness. So my primary thing would be to incorporate all of the available treatments. I'll let Miriam talk about the design.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think those are really important points. Thinking just, if we were doing studies of buprenorphine alone with Reset O, which, has some value to look at it in that slice, I think, some important issues are we obviously need longer periods of time in a trial. A randomized trial would be extremely helpful to just know that the 2 groups are likely to be similar and having similar influences on their lives, external influences. There's so many temporal trends in opioid treatment, the opioid epidemic, that without that, it's really hard to compare 2 different groups, geographic trends, temporal trends. And I think we would want to look at, what are the patients who have the intervention achieving in their lives in terms of the goals that they want to achieve? Are they more successful than someone who doesn't have this app at getting work, reconnecting with family and friends? What do they report about their level of distress, their symptomatology, and so on? And then obviously over time, look at some of the bigger outcomes. Do we see an impact on emergency department use, hospitalization, mortality, et cetera?
Yeah.
Steve, could I comment on
that? I was going to come back. Yeah. I feel like I'm being questioned in the police office.
Yeah, it's the summer sun. I apologize. It's a good day at Boston.
That's right. You're looking angelic, Michael. What would you like to say?
I don't mean to at all, but I do want to see if we could add some value to the panelists. As the team saw from Steve's review, Reset O has been studied in combination with methadone. But important to note is that at PAIR, we're fully invested in ongoing research, both clinical and outcomes-based research. And I know we'll get to the opportunity to speak about outcomes because we know outcomes and value are what drive our healthcare system and what drive payer coverage. So I know we'll get there, but to answer the question on research, Steve, payer is undertaking additional studies, including that Reset O has been selected by the NIH and by NIDA, and we will be conducting a large randomized trial evaluating it in combination with the injectable buprenorphine containing agents, as well as extended release naltrexone. So, and as we know, the extended release products are, quite expensive. So Reset O is fractionally priced against something, but know that the NIH and NIDA and PAIR are collaborating in large randomized way moving forward.
That's great. I want to ask. So, having heard what some of the clinical experts would see as really helpful research, some of it, I mean, if I'm again putting it into different contexts, it would require a very large study with kind of flow through to the patient-centered outcomes of mortality and things where you would probably need a very large, patient group. Do the companies that are in the innovation space of digital health technologies, do they have the capital to do these kinds of randomized controlled trials? Do they have to partner with a payer or provider group in order to kind of get these things going? Tell us about what the landscape looks like in terms of how feasible those kinds of studies would be for you all. Hans, what do you think?
Sure. So, Michael mentioned the study that the NIH and NIDA are putting on. We're actually part of that study as well. So it's actually an example of the fact that there are lots of research organizations and great academic organizations that are interested in this subject and are organizing, large trials to this effect. So I don't think it's dependent on the manufacturer to do so. We're a well-capitalized company, but on a much smaller scale, more focused on sort of, the business that we serve every day. So from that perspective, I'd say that we expect and continue, regularly are asked for our platform to be part of studies, both small and large, and I think that'll continue, and we welcome it. But I don't think it's dependent on the manufacturers to be able to subsidize that cost.
Michael, what do you think?
We also have investigators as well that wish to run their clinical trials. So we're certainly committed to ongoing research.
Right. I think, again, this is kind of a lesson drawn from another quadrant of the universe, but there's always been some tension, and it's growing, I think, between the standards that the FDA uses for the approval of some drug treatments and what the evidence is that patients and doctors and payers feel like they need to see in order to make a good assessment of the clinical and the cost effectiveness. And given that, at FDA, the standards for DHTs are somewhat a work in progress, and a lot of it is being channeled through some of the old medical device kinds of pathways. I foresee that there's going to be a potential for an even larger gap between the evidence that you would need to get an FDA approval, if you're going to try to get one, and the kind of evidence that Kelsey and Anita and Miriam and Scott were talking about. So I think that, part of what I think we're here to talk about in some way is who owns that gap. If the FDA only expects you to do a very simple follow-on trial on an earlier version where you're not even testing the actual app, and you've got short-term outcomes and no one is harmed, and you get an FDA approval, if the rest of the world says that's not enough, is it on you to generate that evidence, or do you think that payers should accept? If the FDA says yes, payers should say that's all you need.
Yeah,
I think, Hans, I think one thing to keep in mind here is what ICER has said about the drugs for medication-assisted therapy. And I think what we're seeing, at least what was presented today, is that the drugs for medication-assisted therapy received no higher, in fact, lower clinical evidence ratings in the review in 2018 done by ICER, and with not a single vote for everyone for low value for money over the long term. So today's standard of care is ubiquitously covered by payers in an unrestricted way. And together as Americans, we're saying, and we need more of that. Patients need more access to that. So I think the standard, the gap might be in just the understanding of this is a therapeutic with a different route of administration and a different site of care. But other than that, it's the same, and we're holding ourselves to the same standard. Clinical trial evidence backed by FDA authorization, real world evidence to show the value and the outcomes to drive those closure of that gap.
All right.
You know,
Hans?
Yeah, I don't entirely agree. So I think one comment is I said earlier, I don't think it's up to the manufacturers to put all the effort into running these large clinical trials. I think my point was that there are plenty of organizations and researchers who want to study this very effectively. At the same time, when I think about Anita and Kelsey, I recognize that it is imperative for us to come in as a manufacturer and say, let's talk about the value that we bring to your members and your organization. And I do think it's, there is the aspect of the real world can't be underplayed here. And Kelsey and Anita described two very different use cases. Kelsey described, use case where you're working through providers and trying to gain their adoption. Anita mentioned, working through a marketing effort where you're trying to encourage members. And so, it's up to the manufacturer, I think, to really demonstrate how that's going to succeed in that implementation. And it's not enough to just, waive a certification that says, we've achieved, this external credibility that may not be applicable to these very unique workflows. And so that's just a little bit of how we see it a little differently.
All right. Let me reflect back with the patient folks before we go in a different direction. And I want to make sure that Kevin or Jake or both, you've heard folks talk about what good future research might look like, some of the issues around evidence standards between the FDA and what payers are looking for. You've heard Anita and Kelsey talk a fair amount about those standards that they're looking for. From a patient's perspective, is this going to capture what you think is most important to the patient? Do you think there's a good way for that information to be gathered in the current trials that are ongoing, or are we missing something that's of great importance to patients that needs to be woven into those kinds of studies?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. No, I guess I would start by framing it this way. I think from the patient perspective, there needs to be some standard as to what's safe and effective, right? And so I think when it comes to medicines, the FDA approval is that standard. Now, as it's been discussed, there's a different standard when it comes to digital therapeutics, and that's an evolving space. But from a consumer perspective, these things are sort of distinctions without a difference. And so I think where I would be a little worried is if you want to have at least that minimum standard be pursued, or be understood, or some standard at least. And so that's where we've always tried to just as an organization position ourselves with the medicines. Okay, are they FDA approved? That's a standard we can all agree to. I think this is an evolving space, but I think that's just a point of clarity for an individual. And so in terms of to your question, I think as a patient, they are typically going to want to try something that's going to work for them. And this again goes to, you want to have a minimum standard of what's safe and effective, but then you also would want someone to be able to try what's going to work for them. That's where we go again. Different formulations may work for one. As was discussed earlier today, it's a very heterogeneous disease. And so this idea that this might work for a subset of patients who are more attracted to something on their phone or something that's less stigmatizing, that might work really, really well for a subset, and having access to it, I think would be really, really important. Again, assuming there's some kind of minimum standard, whether it's FDA or from some other body, is met in terms of effectiveness. And then the last point I wanted to make, I do think on the cost perspective, something I haven't heard today is just this driving of a small subset of behavioral health conditions driving a huge percentage of the overall cost in the healthcare system. And so to the extent that a tool, be it a digital therapeutic, can help align treatment in an outpatient versus a less expensive setting, or that real world evidence is showing that we've got less severe outcomes, these should be really, really important questions that we should all be asking, payers, public and commercial alike. So I do think that was maybe lost a little bit in the discussion, and though it's been very much present in this conversation, is a really important outcome. And, along with obviously this is a disease with, severe mortality in tens of thousands per year and growing this year, especially because of COVID.
Yeah. One thing before, Jake, before you jump in, because something you said, Kevin, struck me. It's, and we heard this around, the difference between naltrexone and buprenorphine. It's important to have different options because people will just have very important but different reasons for doing better with one treatment versus the other. And one thing that we often chide drug makers for is that they need to do better research to help us predict which patients will respond better to one drug versus another drug. So similarly here, it would be nice to know if there's some kind of simple test that a prospective patient could take and they get steered off. You're good for the digital app. Nope, you'll be better off served by this other kind of approach, peer support. So those kinds of upfront screening tools might be another area for some future work. Jake, you were going to.
You guys both said it perfectly. Just to add one thing, I mean, even a decade into my recovery, the toughest thing for me to do sometimes is split my personalities between a person in recovery and a clinician. And speaking solely as a person in recovery and on behalf of other patients, I think it would be nice to get to the point, Steve, where we do have some of those variables, or we have a guideline that says if a person has A, B, and C, they're a methadone patient, X, Y, and Z, they're buprenorphine, and so forth. And the same thing with digital apps. We don't have anything close to that right now. And to me, the name of the game is engagement. And that engagement is typically a bargaining process with a patient. What are you willing to do? And the first time I ever heard about digital therapeutics in SUD, my mind went, okay, so I'm dealing with primarily an 18 to 35-year-old age group who lives in a digital world. Even to Michael's point, if 10% of those patients took advantage, and this was the engagement or the key they needed to get their foot into treatment, I'm good with that. We have to open all of these doors to patients and see which ones they're willing to participate in. Right now, we don't have the luxury of saying one approach is better than the other.
Could I, Steve, make a comment to Jake, as I think an important point just came up. I mean, NIH is 8-to-1 return on investment. For every dollar invested in treatment, $8 return. But I think the hypothesis perhaps that we've been speaking about today might be, the paradigm might be a bit different. I've heard a lot of discussion of replacement, as if these apps are meant to replace physicians, and that's not the paradigm. This is meant to augment and to improve and to make the conversation stronger. This is meant, and I know not all the clinical experts had a chance to do deep dive demos of Reset-O, but this physician-patient interaction is what's so valuable. It's this neurobehavioral counseling is what's so valuable. And we know that from a quadruple aim perspective, we know and we hear physicians having better experiences themselves as a result of being able to engage in this way. So it's not meant to be a replacement. I heard that alluded to, and I think that changed the economic modeling too, right? If we're thinking about replacement versus augmentation, and I think we modeled it as augmentation, but I don't think we should be thinking about it as replacement.
I don't think people were thinking of Reset-O, for instance, as trying to replace the physician's role or even cut back on it. But it is an area in which some apps will try to explore whether there's greater value, whether it's in OUD or other areas, but it frequently comes up. All right, I'm going to kind of have to start to do a bit of quick, rapid response to get back to a couple issues that I want to make sure we cover before we close it out. I do want to talk first about how we pay for these, if they are to be covered by insurance. Do they offer themselves up, given the evidence base as we saw it today, where durability of effect is one of the key uncertainties? Is this an opportunity for a payer and a manufacturer to say, let's have an outcomes-based agreement where if X% of patients are on it or on treatment after a certain number of months, there's a pay back or a pay forward. It could be an individual case by case. If a patient's out of treatment at 6 months, then all the money's refunded. There are different ways to structure this, and drug companies and payers are now actively exploring a lot of these kinds of things. The other approach would be to do it as a subscription model, where the company would say, we'll give you all of these that you need for a flat fee, And we won't make an extra penny if it's used more, or, you know, it's just kind of, we're all about your being able to use it and get it out to as many people as possible for a flat fee. I'm wondering if I can turn back to the payers again, and as you think about how you want to pay for these, is it pretty much just a pill by pill kind of fee at this point, or are you looking at more innovative approaches? Kelsey, why don't you start?
Yeah, so our clients, they typically appreciate the more innovative approach, really ensuring, again, that every dollar in their budget is stretched, making sure that we're making impactful differences for their membership. And so what we would expect to see are guaranteed outcomes and some reassurance of engagement rates and retention rates. So can you engage the members? So that the importance of having these different options. So can you guarantee that we're going to get so many engagements, and can we keep them engaged? And then for those, can we guarantee some outcomes? So it's almost a guarantee based or at-risk model that we're most interested in.
Okay, Anita, what would you say?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different models. So we can do a PMPM model, which is a subscription model. And then for something like this, it would generally be a provider contract plus the PMPM model. But because there's not a lot of real world evidence, and there's no just series of payer clients that have used this product before and can produce us like a reference or data from it. The approach that we would take in this case would be investing, maybe like a small amount of investment, and then piloting, implementing, and co-development. So that's important because it hasn't been proven out with other payers. And there's a lot that goes into the cost besides just what was presented earlier from the payer side, because we need to do marketing, we need to do customer service training, we have to integrate it into our other digital platforms. So if we were to try an SSO integration, so it's easier to engage our members by implementing it through our existing app, then that costs also additional dollars. So we need to think about all that. And then we also need to think about what's the scalability of whatever company we're working with. Because it's not just a pill that a pharmaceutical company is manufacturing.
Right.
And there's a lot of components involved, and scalability is always a concern, is if we're trying to implement it across different lines of business.
All right, that's fantastic. All right, my time is drawing nigh. Let me keep going with a couple other quick questions that I know people are going to want a quick answer to somewhere in our report. This, in particular, Reset-O, we can use that as the archetype for right now. Should it be prescribed by anyone, PCPs, anybody? Only by addiction specialists, only by cognitive and behavioral psychotherapists? Who can prescribe this, and how do we decide what the trade-offs would be? The companies I know have thought about this as part of their business model. Is the business model for PCPs to be prescribing this, gentlemen?
Steve, if the answer is for payer or for Reset-O, the answer is licensed physicians are the population, and we believe that physicians should make the patient level decision to prescribe.
Okay, how about the Hans, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to be rude. I'm going to be, okay, go ahead, real quick. Now I'm going to jump to the clinical experts.
Two comments. One is that, there are times when a great person to introduce a piece of technology, supportive technology, to an individual might be a peer recovery coach. Could be the recovery coach that's supporting them as they leave a residential treatment program. Could be a counselor. So that's actually, we think, one of the limitations of requiring a prescription. It actually makes it harder to get the technology in the hands of individuals. And then briefly on the reimbursement side, I think a great model in the long run would actually be for the payer, for a provider to be able to bill on a monthly basis to their payer. And in a way, the provider's getting reimbursed, whether that's a recovery coach, so it could be recovery coaching plus or a visit plus, they're getting reimbursed for their time, and they're introducing the technology to their patients. And so we think a subscription model, which has actually been proposed to the AMA, and there's a CPT code being considered right now for a model like that.
By the way, I agree with Hans on the counselor aspect, because we see in the real world counselors referring back to their physician, the physician prescription. So we don't believe there's a barrier at all there. We in fact believe that there's a really strong care team connection of identifying the opportunity to deliver higher engagement and long-standing durable retention and treatment. So we think it's strong there.
Michael, I have to come back to you real quickly because one of the questions that I know the team wanted to ask and get into the record was the 12-week limit to the subscription that patients get to Reset O. When we heard from patient, kind of experts and others that, patients will want to come back and refresh and access maybe the system again. Why not make your intervention time unlimited for people who are willing to buy it up front? Oops, you muted yourself.
Sorry, Steve, I muted. As you know, we're regulated, so the FDA has given us a label of the period of prescription. So these things would require re-regulation in that regard. So the period length is as the FDA label requires.
Okay, just to be clear, it could still require a second prescription, but you could decide not to charge for it.
No, that's not what I said.
I know it's not what you said, but you could.
No, it's possible that a patient and a physician could independently decide to utilize the product again.
Yes, I guess my point was in terms of the finances, it's a product in which if it's required to be a maximum of 12 weeks by the FDA as part of it could be re-prescribed, but you could not charge the patient and payer for that second prescription for the same person. I know that administrative bookkeeping and all that kind of stuff would probably make it very difficult, but it's something that, as you can imagine, patients and clinical experts will be thinking about because they recognize that many of these interventions are not one and done. It's going to be an ongoing process of treatment for many, many people.
Yeah, it's a good point, Steve, because we do see patients in our compassionate use program that have utilized product longer. And as you know, from our real world evidence, that's been generated off of compassionate use.
Right. Okay. Can you believe that our time is up? That was an hour. And it feels like I could go back to each of you and spend another hour to learn more. What we like to do, though, at the end is to let each of you have a final statement. We really do ask if you would please keep it to one sentence with, you can have a comma, generous to use a semicolon if the clauses are short enough. And please feel free to either make a request of another stakeholder that you think should do something that would really make the world a better place for patients, for the overall health system. It can be one theme that you really want to make sure gets hammered in and emphasized in the report. It can be something that you haven't had the chance to say yet, but really would hate to leave the arena without having it said. So you each get one sentence to do that, whichever you prefer. And I'd like to start actually with Hans. I'm just going to go around my screen. Hans, would you mind starting?
My quick sentence is the name of our app is not the other app. It's the Connections app. We're at Chess Health, and I'd welcome a conversation with any of you. I'm sure it'd be enlightening, and I'd love to share more about what we do.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Our product saved $2,150 on average per patient in 6 months. And we know that OUD is an enormous medical need. The medical necessity of Reset O is clear. We know that it works. And ICER has shown it to be cost effective. We call on payers to do the right thing in the middle of the epidemic that we're facing and to provide coverage for the product for patients in need at their physician's discretion.
All right, thank you. All right, let me continue on to the payers. Kelsey?
Sure. So the concept of using technology to support the recovery of patients with OUD and the support of medication-assisted treatment, hands down, a need for patients and providers, no argument there. But just as we continue to scrutinize traditional therapies that have FDA approvals of the highest standards, knowing that we don't cover all medications, that have been approved by the FDA, that we still have formularies and preferred medications that have demonstrated superior outcomes, and we have utilization management techniques to help ensure that we're maximizing dollars. We'll continue to do the same in the digital therapeutic space, and we look forward to the introduction of a digital therapeutic in this space that provides the value that we're looking for.
Thank you very much. Anita.
So we usually go through hundreds of different digital health products and evaluate them. So I think it's really important to have the real world evidence. And I really encourage the manufacturers to have a strategic partnership with the payers to get access to their membership so that you can produce the real world evidence.
Thanks. This is very, very helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, clinical experts, you're the next tier here. Who would like to go first, Miriam or Scott?
I'll go first so that Miriam gets the last word. I think that the digital therapeutics have enormous potential to help people with substance use disorders, and in particular non-opioid use disorders. But in terms of the question at hand of opioid use disorders, we know what works. And for most people, that is opioid agonist treatment. So if we can have these therapeutics demonstrate more conclusively that we can connect people to what we already know saves lives, then I'm all for it. And I look forward to seeing the results of these randomized controlled trials, the long-term follow-up from these patients that were treated almost 10 years ago now. I look forward to reviewing those papers.
Thanks very much, Scott. All right, Miriam.
Great. I concur with everything Scott said. And I would just add that I think, a place where we clearly do have a huge need in the opioid treatment space is in getting patients into medication treatment. So if there are ways to create or adapt apps to be an adjunct to meeting with your physician, a therapist, harm reductionist, to help people make the decision to get into treatment, doing decisional balance or sort of basic motivational interviewing tools, and walking a patient through thinking about those kinds of how do you make a decision? How do you weigh the problems? I think something like that could be really, really helpful, because that's a place where clearly as a system, we really fall down and we're losing people and they're dying because they don't get into treatment in time. So I'd love to see development in that area as well.
All right, thank you very much. All right, gentlemen, patient representatives, you get the last word. Why don't I start with Kevin?
Great, thank you. I saw a story this morning. Fatal overdoses are up 39% this year in Virginia. We see stories like that all across the country and other states. The first slide this morning was the cost of $2.4 trillion over 3 or 4 years. This is a disease that needs innovation and that needs to try things new, to handle an epidemic on top of the pandemic, which is stated this morning. So anyway, look forward to hearing the evidence and seeing policies that really incentivize further innovation be enacted.
Great, thank you. Jake.
Yeah, and again, the disclaimer solely from the patient perspective here. I think given where we are in this tragic epidemic that has affected so many, I firmly believe we're at a point where we need to do our best to remove barriers that are in place that are preventing folks that are willing to use these products to assist in their recovery. Again, it's a bargaining process. And if somebody's willing to participate through their phone or whatever it may be, or build a community, that could be their first step into a larger world, as the famous Obi-Wan Kenobi once said. So thank you guys again for allowing me to participate. It's been great.
No, thank you. You guys provided a really fantastic policy roundtable that will make a real nice capstone to the overall report. And we'll be translating this into some perspectives on the different policies looking forward for people to digest. So on behalf of the CEPAC, I would like to thank you, you guys. And I know the CEPAC, if you guys can start to turn your cameras on again, we're going to turn to you for your final statements. But that was fantastic. And with that, actually, why don't we go back out of the slide? There we go. That was just to let everybody know what's happening next. But that was great from the policy roundtable. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just pick on people as we go around the Midwest CEPAC, but we have 15 minutes. So even more brief than perhaps usual. If you can have your final statement in under a minute, that'll give us time to say goodbye at the end. And in no particular order, I'm going to start with Stuart.
I just want to express my gratitude for everyone on the call who is investigating treatment, implementing treatment, and caring for this vulnerable population whose challenges are immense. So I'm just grateful for all of you.
Thanks very much. Tim McBride.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, the opioid disorder is immense in rural areas and across the whole country. So, I'm sitting here thinking it's important we deal with this, and the challenges are huge. And I was wanting this to come to a better outcome in terms of, clinical and cost outcome. And I think we can get there, but I just don't feel like the studies got there, but they may at some point. So, and I think that the needs are really important in terms of for caregivers, for productivity, for disparities. So I just want to make a comment about that. And I just have for a call out in terms of better studies about that, and we need more evidence. And if we can get the evidence out there that it's cost saving, then the payers will follow.
Okay, thanks very much. Greg?
Thank you, Steve. Steve, that was just a fascinating policy discussion, and you did a masterful job leading the discussion. I learned a lot from it. And the comment that I'd like to make is there were a whole range of opinions during the policy discussion. And it got me to thinking about the role of the FDA here. And the FDA approved this app on the basis of a 510K clearance, on the basis of a single clinical trial that didn't really examine that particular app. And it just got me wondering whether the FDA did the right thing here, or whether they put something out there and now everyone is scrambling to try to figure out what to do with it. The payers don't really seem to want to pay for it because there isn't really evidence of efficacy or cost effectiveness. And yet patients seem to want it. And so do we have to ask the FDA to develop better criteria to look at these kinds of digital interventions and go back to the drawing board and work a little harder in terms of developing criteria for approval, particularly if they're just going to go down the 510K route, which is the only conceivable way they could have approved this app, but they didn't really have any evidence, so they had no other route to go. But if they keep doing that, is that really a good route to go down, or is it simply going to increase the cost of healthcare overall?
All right, thank you very much. Megan.
Well, I would like to thank everybody who participated and just say that I guess I want to echo what Kevin said a couple minutes ago, which is that even though that the evidence in this case wasn't very strong, there really is an urgent need to incentivize and fund innovation to improve patient outcomes in this area.
Thank you very much. Albert?
So I mean, this was a really just a fascinating meeting and topic and set of therapy and set of interventions. What's really neat about it is these are interventions that are designed to boost adherence to other therapeutics. So that I think is just fascinating. It's not the drug itself that's the meat, but the spice, as someone else said. And I think that's just fascinating. These apps are really, really, I'm not a tech person at all, but I think they're just really attractive because of their scalability. We did not talk about this. They're easily prescribed. They have minimal harm. So if they can generate some small benefit across the population, there could be huge benefit. But of course, I'm a evidence-based medicine person. I know that the evidence is very limited, but I think we should think more broadly. Is the traditional clinical trial the right design, or is something from implementation science more appropriate? If a doctor's able to treat more patients with the help of these apps, or reach more people, or boost adherence, that should be considered. I look forward to the future studies of these apps.
All right, thanks a lot. Stacy.
Oh, I'll just follow up and say like others, I thought this was an incredibly helpful meeting and a really interesting topic, and appreciate everyone's fantastic input throughout the day. I guess to just follow up on where Albert was going there, I think that some of the things from the policy roundtable that came up to me were the ideas of these partnerships with payers and thinking about real world evidence generation, and even things like pragmatic trials or pragmatic studies that could really generate the evidence that we need to backfill and know, that it is something worth paying for. But I think there is a lot of promise and there's a lot of need. So I hope the evidence base follows.
Fantastic. Chris Jones.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you for that excellent panel. And thank you all for these wonderful comments that are enlightening. And especially thanks to patient experts, service users. And I think this is, extremely important perspective that we must always take. Never before have we really had a panel where absolutely everyone who participates has been affected somehow by the disorder and by the challenge and by all the treatments. So, in my case, I lost a dear friend who was a medical doctor. Before he took his own life, he said he was not addicted to pills. He was addicted to the cessation of pain. So I just say that because we should always keep in mind that this is highly heterogeneous, that we want to make sure that we address the goals for the individual patient. And I'll stop there and just say thanks all.
Thank you very much, Chris. Tim.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think maybe sometimes you heard me being one of the more skeptical individuals, but that's not to downplay the seriousness of the conditions, and that I think we all are searching for ways to more effectively provide the care that people need in an efficient fashion. And I do think there's, reflecting on both what Greg said and what Albert and others said, I think we need rigorous research, but I think there's ways to get there, particularly with these kind of interventions that don't require a drug A versus placebo kind of study. I think those can be designed, they should be designed. I think if they were there, we probably would have looked and found them, but I think moving forward, we can try and incorporate that stuff like we've done in other evidence reviews that can guide us forward, but also to look to see whether some of these things add care complexity. As a primary care doc, I see one more little reminder, one more little app, one more little thing to do that people just say, well, it's just one more thing. That's the number of little things to do. And in this case, is the app really saving workload? If those kind of things could be looked at, but as structured, I saw it more as an add-on to something else without evidence of clear benefit. So again, thanks for everybody. Thanks for the concerns, particularly for the patient individual who said something like, paraphrasing, I felt like I had a care provider in my pocket or on my phone or something like that. That was a powerful statement.
Thanks very much. Jean?
So I want to also thank everyone. As always, I learned so much, and I'm very grateful for all you do. I've been cycling between disappointment and frustration and hope for this entire session. So disappointment and the evidence and the lack of the evidence, frustration with the business model, and also with the barriers that the regulation and the business model put up, and also with the sense that everything has to be cited in the conventional medical system. And you know, we really don't have enough bandwidth to manage that. And then hope, of course, that, you know, really smart people are working on this and we can make some progress. So that's where I am this afternoon.
Thanks, Jean. Greg?
This has been a great discussion. I've been really encouraged that I've heard people arguing opposite positions and agreed with both sides, and that's been a wonderful sensation these days. The one thing I'm hearing so much agreement, though, is it's all about the evidence. Like anything that has sounded critical or negative, it's never been about opioids. It's all about, boy, we're just hungry for more evidence. And so I'm going to take that as a positive point, because once we have more evidence and less uncertainty, I think there's going to be a lot of alignment. So thanks.
Thanks, I appreciate that very much. Jill?
I guess I would just say thank you for Oscar's concern with really every facet of this discussion. Y'all always put so much thought in each of your topics. I hope really no one walks away from today's discussion or, you know, looks at this recording and takes away thinking that the low value determination in any way diminishes the importance of this opioid problem. And so I hope it drives the development of better peer reviewed and published evidence. And just want to thank you for having me on the panel.
Great, thanks, Jill. Don?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for putting this on. I think it comes at an opportune moment given everything that's going on. I actually put my final comment in the chat, so I'm going to read it because the word heterogeneity stuck out to me as being a real big barrier to us achieving a better insight. And so I'll say that heterogeneity of target populations and evaluation methods may be good for early phase discovery and proof of concept, which is what I see all over the place with digital health companies. But it's not good for the generation of meaningful and concordant real world evidence, especially as it's becoming espoused by groups like FDA and CDC. I believe that all digital health firms are missing the boat, not just the ones we're talking about, but in their ability to ensure greater upstream cooperation, communication, and collaboration in order to demonstrate a true impact on health with real world evidence. And I think Anita Ju hit it on the head in terms of making that point. So I just want to emphasize it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Don. Chair, Eric. Dr. Chair.
I put a note in the chat just for everybody to note that, you know, the talent that's on this call and the developers and the patients, they could choose lots of things to focus their time and effort on. But the work here, let's not lose sight of the fact that when we talk about OUD, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society. This isn't just a cancer patient. There's a whole set of social determinants of health that are at play with this particular population. And so there's a lot of gratitude, I think, when we see we see innovation happening in this particular space. You know, a decade ago or longer, I did a lot of work in diabetes management. And I've been trying during this call to grab some numbers on how much money the NIH and the CDC spent to develop the evidence for the diabetes prevention program, which people have cited today a couple of times as, boy, wouldn't it be great if this particular technology or this particular intervention lived up to the standards that we saw and the data and the evidence that came out of the DPP. But my guess is that we're dealing with mental health and behavioral health and substance use parity or lack of equity issues on why there hasn't been a comparable investment for similar prevention or enhancement, you know, technologies. So I kind of, you know, it's not an excuse. It's just I think that that's a fact that's at play and is a disadvantage to innovators that are in the mental health, behavioral health, and substance use disorder space. So those are my final thoughts for today. Thanks.
Great. So I have to thank again all of you on the Midwest CEPAC and those who are participating as part of the CEPAC today. Thank you again for the time that you took to read this material, to really understand it, to wrestle with it, and to bring the perspectives that you did to this meeting. I'll echo again your thanks to the patient representatives and to all the folks who came for our policy roundtable. Our videos are watched very often, even after the meetings. So curated, sections of this will live on, and I hope it will stimulate a lot of important thinking. It's been said, and some of ICER's earliest work in this area was all about MAT works. And we have to get over the stigma. We have to get over the problems of worrying about who's going to get methadone and who's not, and who's in whose backyard and who's not. And we were in New England when we first started doing this, and New Hampshire was suffering one of the early really bad surges of opioid epidemics. And Jean and others were finding it as a community level problem, just overwhelming, and it is such. So, working on everything from expanding access to methadone, prescribers for buprenorphine, we are hungry. We're probably not spending near enough on this problem in this country, but that means we have to get it right when we do want to spend something on something new. And so I like you, I come away hopeful that we can have a role in helping to set a clear standard for good evidence in this space. ICER will do more digital health therapeutics, and I think this will be an ongoing thing that we can take on. And little things like the idea of real world evidence, which are so critical to help understand the real world effects, but it can be a kind of a tagline that gets misused as well. And we all know that real world evidence can be completely useless in terms of understanding the effectiveness of something. And so we can't get into a world in which we miss the opportunity to set the standards that patients and clinicians and payers need to make sure that we're using our resources in the best way possible to help these patients. We don't want them wasting their time in one avenue that's just not as good as another one. We need better ways to figure out how to kind of target patients towards different treatment options. And this conversation today, I think, has been a great start to continue to think about that in the digital space.
Hey, Steve, we're going to start a new tradition with the Midwest CEPAC, which is as we have new members that join in, let them reflect on. We didn't hear from
Angela.
We didn't hear from Angela, and so I thought we would give her the opportunity. Like, this is her first time to be part of a Midwest CEPAC. We did it via Zoom, and Angela, for QI purposes and others, if you have any reflections on your experience with this today, we'd love to close out with your thoughts as a new member to our community, if that's okay, Steve.
I couldn't agree more.
Great.
Thank you for hanging on. It's a little after the hour, but Angela,
thanks,
please
everybody.
send us out on a high note. Angela, what should we know?
No problem. I'll be quick. Thank you all. This has definitely been a great enlightening experience. I think, I agree with all of the comments that have been stated, and definitely feel we should stay hopeful. There is a whole community of people that need us to be that way, just to make sure we can get them the right solutions they need to live well. So thank you. And this was very great. I look forward to more of these.
Great, and welcome. So I usually say safe travels on the way back from our meeting. So don't trip on your way back to the kitchen. Be well, and the next steps of this will come up in a slide in just a second, but we'll be working on our final report, which will include the votes and a description of this conversation. Should be ready within another couple weeks. In the meantime, have a happy Thanksgiving, a safe one with you and your families, and let's wish our country better times in the coming year. My best to everybody.